You know, some books aren't just words on a page. They become these historical artifacts that we really have to try and understand. So today, we're going to dig into the ideological origins of one of history's most notorious books, and we're going to do it by looking at how the author himself explains how his worldview came to be.
Now, I want to be crystal clear about something right up front. This is not an endorsement of any kind. For this explainer, we're treating Mein Kampf as a primary source document. The whole goal here is to analyze its contents, its structure, and the story the author tells to understand where these ideas came from, using the text itself as our guide.
So, here's how we're going to break this down. First, we'll look at what the book was supposed to be for. Then, we'll get into the author's style, and from there, we'll trace the origin story he builds for himself, from his childhood all the way to his years in Vienna, which is where he claims the very core of his ideology was born. So, what was this book supposed to be? Well, if you read the preface, it claims it was written to lay out the aims of his movement. But as you can imagine, a deeper historical look tells a slightly different story. This quote, wow, it really hits you. It's from Konrad Hayden, who was an early critic of the Nazis, and he wrote this in an introduction way back in 1943. He's basically arguing that the real engine behind this book wasn't memory or reflection, it was just pure burning political rage. So according to Hayden, this thing is not an autobiography, not even close. He saw it as a carefully crafted political weapon. It was made to attack people he felt had wronged him, to basically declare himself the one and only leader, to settle scores, and maybe most importantly, to build up this larger-than-life myth about himself.
Okay, so let's shift gears and talk about the author's style. How did he talk about his own work, and how does that compare to what a critical analysis of the text reveals? Well, the difference is pretty stark.
So on one side, you have Hitler presenting his book as this clear, essential document for his movement, better than some dry academic text. But then, you look at what the translator, Rolf Mannheim, had to say, and it's just brutal. He calls the writing slovenly, illogical, pretentious. But here's the real insight. It's not just about bad writing. The point is that the chaotic, paranoid style is the message. It's a perfect reflection of an ideology built on personal grudges and a completely warped view of reality, not on logic or reason. Okay, so keeping that chaotic style in mind, let's dive into the story he actually tells about himself. The first part of the book is all about crafting this origin story, making it seem like his youth wasn't just a series of events, but this clear, determined path toward his political destiny. He starts right at his birthplace and immediately gives it this huge significance, calling it a symbol of a great mission. From there, he paints a picture of his childhood that's full of conflict and loss, all of which he uses to justify his later hardness and determination. The big drama, the main conflict he sets up, is this battle with his dad. His father was a civil servant and wanted him to be one too. But Hitler paints himself as this born artist, fighting against a boring, ordinary future. This line, a civil servant? Never, is framed as this epic first major test of his will. So what's the point of all this? What does he say he learned from these early years? He boils it down to two main things: becoming a fanatical German nationalist and developing this special ability to understand the deep currents of history. So, in his own story, he was already thinking like a politician, even as a kid. And all of this leads him to Vienna. After his mother passes away, he makes the move to the big city. He describes his time there as 5 years of misery and poverty, but also, and this is key, as the very furnace where his entire political philosophy was forged. So the big takeaway from Vienna, according to him, boils down to this. It's where he claims he figured out the two menaces that were threatening the German people. And these become the absolute twin pillars of his ideology: Marxism and what he calls Jewry. And in his telling, this wasn't some overnight epiphany. No, he lays it out like it's a logical progression, a step-by-step journey to enlightenment. It starts with him seeing how poor the workers are. That leads him to argue with social democrats on a construction site. Then he starts reading their newspapers. And the final piece is his total disgust with the Austrian parliament, which he sees as chaotic and corrupt. All of this solidifies his hatred for both Marxism and democracy. This path leads us right to the absolute darkest part of his Vienna story. He goes from a political critique to building what he would later call the granite foundation of his entire worldview, a deep, violent anti-Semitism. He frames this whole discovery through something called the Jewish question. He writes that once he figured this question out, it was like a key that unlocked the truth about everything else. He started to believe that social democracy wasn't a real movement for workers,
but just a giant Jewish conspiracy to take down the nation.
And he details this so-called transformation with these very specific stories. It supposedly starts when he sees an Orthodox Jew on the street, which leads him to go read anti-Semitic pamphlets. From there, he claims to see Jewish influence behind everything he considers corrupt: art, newspapers, prostitution. It all leads him to conclude that social democracy is run by Jews, and he sums up this whole journey with one simple, chilling sentence: "I gradually began to hate them."
And this is where it all culminates. This quote right here is how he ends the chapter describing his transformation in Vienna. He takes his hatred and elevates it into some kind of divine mission. In his own mind, he's not just a political figure anymore. He's doing God's work. He's fighting a holy war.
So as we start to wrap up this look at the book's ideological beginnings, it's so important to understand how the author saw these ideas. For him, they weren't just reflections on his past. They were a plan for the future. And this is maybe the most crucial takeaway, and it's right there in his own words. He says point blank that the worldview he built in Vienna became the granite foundation for everything he would do later. This book wasn't just a memoir. It was meant to be a blueprint. The ideas he put on the page were a direct announcement of what he planned to do in the real world.
Which leaves us with a really big, unsettling question, doesn't it? When you trace the ideological journey he lays out in these first few chapters, you're forced to think about the incredible power of a single written story. It makes you ask, how does an ideology of pure hate written down in a book actually become the catalyst for some of the darkest chapters in all of human history?